It was the summer of 2019 when everything changed for me. I had just returned from college to spend a few weeks at my dad's place. I wasn't particularly close to him after my parents' divorce, but he insisted that I visit for a change of scenery. Little did I know, this trip would turn my world upside down. My dad, a man in his late 40s, had remarried 2 years prior. His new wife, Claire, was stunning. She was in her early 30s with a sharp sense of humor and an effortless charm that made people gravitate toward her. I was polite during our first few meetings, but the relationship was surface level at best. After all, she was my dad's wife, and I never thought much beyond that. Until that summer. My dad worked long hours, often leaving Claire and me alone at the house. At first it was awkward. I spent most of my time in the guest room or out with friends, but Claire made an effort to include me in her world. She invited me to go running with her in the mornings, watch movies in the evenings, and even cook dinner together. Slowly, the initial awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a sense of ease I hadn't expected. One night, while making dinner, Claire casually mentioned how much she admired my ambition and independence. "You've grown into such an impressive young man," she said, her eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than usual. It was a small compliment, but it felt different. I brushed it off, attributing it to her friendly nature. But that was just the beginning. A week into my stay, Claire and I found ourselves alone again. My dad had flown out for a business conference, leaving the house unusually quiet. With no one else around, the dynamic between us shifted subtly but unmistakably. We cooked dinner together that evening. Pasta and salad, with a bottle of wine my dad had been saving for a special occasion. Claire insisted we open it, laughing as she poured us each a glass. "It's just wine," she said with a wink. "Your dad won't mind." The first glass went down easily, loosening the stiffness that often accompanied our interactions. By the second, the conversation flowed more freely. Claire seemed lighter, her laughter ringing out more often. Her usual composed demeanor gave way to something more relaxed, almost playful. I couldn't help but notice how the candle light softened her features, highlighting the sharp elegance of her cheekbones and the way her hair framed her face. After dinner, we moved to the dining table, the bottle of wine now half empty. Claire leaned back in her chair, swirling the crimson liquid in her glass. She looked at me thoughtfully for a moment before setting her glass down with a faint sigh. "I need to tell you something," she said, her tone suddenly serious. The shift in her mood caught me off guard. Her usual confidence seemed to falter, replaced by an unexpected vulnerability. She folded her hands on the table, her fingers fidgeting slightly, a rare display of nervousness from someone who always seemed so self-assured. "What is it?" I asked, unsure of what to expect. She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "I feel like I can talk to you in a way I can't with anyone else," she said finally. "Not even your dad." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I couldn't fully grasp yet. I didn't know how to respond, so I nodded, signaling for her to continue. She looked down at her hands, her voice quieter now. "I've been feeling disconnected," she confessed. "Your father is a wonderful man, but sometimes I feel like he's more focused on work than on us, like I'm just an afterthought." Her words were laced with a raw honesty that made me uncomfortable. I mumbled something sympathetic, unsure where this conversation was heading. Claire glanced up at me, her eyes searching mine. "It's hard, you know, to feel unseen, unheard. I think that's why I enjoy spending time with you. You listen. You're different." I opened my mouth to respond, but she wasn't done. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be with someone who truly understands me," she continued, her voice soft but steady. Then she looked directly at me, her gaze unwavering. "Someone like you." My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, the world seemed to slow, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock magnified in the silence that followed her words. Was this really happening? Did I misinterpret her? But the way she looked at me, her eyes heavy with unspoken intent, her lips parted as if waiting for a response, left no room for doubt. I froze, caught between disbelief and a rising panic. My pulse quickened, my palms suddenly clammy. This wasn't a casual comment or a harmless compliment. It was a line crossed, a shift in the boundaries of our relationship that couldn't be undone. "Claire, I started, my voice barely above a whisper, but I didn't know what to say, how to navigate the minefield she had just laid before me. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with emotions I didn't want to name. Her vulnerability, her words, even the wine, all of it created a haze that made it hard to think clearly. I felt the weight of her gaze, the quiet expectation in her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I felt tempted. But I couldn't. This was my dad's wife. And yet, as much as I wanted to dismiss her words as a momentary lapse, something in the way she looked at me told me this wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, carefully considered, and that realization terrified me. In the days that followed, Claire's behavior grew increasingly bold, her actions crossing the fine line between friendly and flirtatious. At first, it was subtle. A light brush of her hand against mine as we passed dishes at dinner, a lingering touch on my arm when she laughed at something I said, the way her eyes would hold my gaze for a moment longer than seemed necessary. I tried to dismiss it as harmless, convincing myself I was overanalyzing her behavior. After all, she was my dad's wife. Surely I was imagining things. But Claire wasn't subtle for long. She began finding excuses to be close to me. If I was reading in the living room, she'd sit nearby, her presence impossible to ignore. If I mentioned I was heading out to grab coffee or run errands, she'd suggest tagging along, her enthusiasm almost childlike. "It'll be fun," she'd say, flashing a smile that was impossible to refuse without feeling rude. Then there were her compliments. They started small, comments about my taste in music or how mature I'd become since she first met me. But they grew more personal. "You're so different from other guys your age," she remarked one evening. "You have this depth about you." Her tone was light, but her words carried weight, sinking deep into my mind. I told myself to ignore it, to avoid reading into things that weren't there. But a part of me, a darker, more curious part, wondered if her attention was more than just friendly. It all came to a head one evening. We were alone in the living room, a rom-com playing on the TV. I wasn't even paying attention to the movie, my focus shifting between the screen and my phone. Claire, however, seemed unusually animated, laughing loudly at every joke, even the unfunny ones. At some point, she shifted closer to me on the couch, her shoulder brushing against mine. I tensed but didn't move, unsure how to react without making things awkward. Her perfume lingered in the air, a mix of something floral and musky, drawing me in despite myself. "I feel like we have a connection," she said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and yet it felt like a thunderclap in the quiet room. I turned to her, my stomach twisting into knots. Her eyes searched mine, wide and vulnerable, as if she was laying bare some long-held secret. "Don't you?" she asked. I froze, caught between disbelief and the undeniable pull of the moment. Before I could respond, she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. The kiss was brief, almost tentative, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. I pulled away, my heart pounding. "Claire, this isn't right," I stammered, my voice shaking. "You're married to my dad." Her expression shifted, hurt flashing across her face like a storm cloud. "I know," she murmured, her voice barely audible, "but I can't help how I feel." The air between us was thick with tension, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. I stood abruptly, putting as much distance as I could between us. "I need some air," I muttered, not waiting for her response as I left the room. Outside, the cool night breeze hit my face, but it did little to calm the turmoil inside me. What just happened? How had things spiraled so far out of control? And most importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I spent the next few days doing everything I could to avoid Claire. I lingered in my room for hours, only emerging when I was certain she was occupied elsewhere. If I heard her footsteps in the hall, I pretended to be on a phone call or buried in a book. But no matter how much distance I tried to create, guilt followed me like a shadow. It wasn't just the kiss that haunted me, it was the silence I maintained. Every time I thought about calling my dad, my mind spiraled. What could I say? That his wife had kissed me? That she claimed to have feelings for me? The words felt impossible, a betrayal, no matter how I framed them. Claire, however, wasn't the type to be ignored. Early one morning, as I brewed coffee in the kitchen, she cornered me. Her expression was resolute, her usual charm replaced with an air of defiance. "Look," she said, voice steady but tinged with emotion. I know this is complicated, but I can't keep pretending I don't have feelings for you. And I think you feel the same way. I don't, I lied quickly, almost too quickly. She stared at me, her gaze sharp. If that's true, why haven't you told your dad? Her words hit me hard, unraveling the thin veil of self-control I had left. She was right. If I truly felt nothing, why was I holding on to this secret? Because part of me, shamefully, was tempted. Her attention, her connection, it was intoxicating, but I couldn't let myself cross that line. The turning point came when I overheard a phone conversation between Claire and one of her friends. She was laughing, talking about how she had never felt this alive before. It was clear she wasn't just playing a game. She genuinely believed we had something special. That's when I knew I had to put an end to it. I sat her down that evening and told her firmly that nothing could ever happen between us. This isn't about what we feel, I said. It's about what's right. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, and nodded. I understand, she whispered. When my dad returned, everything seemed normal on the surface, but the tension between Claire and me was palpable. I considered telling him the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It would destroy his marriage, his trust in me, and possibly his entire life. Instead, I left early, cutting my trip short. I told my dad I had to get back to school for an important project, and he believed me without question. Claire and I never spoke about what happened. She sent me a single text after I left saying, "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't reply. To this day, I'm haunted by that summer. I often wonder what would have happened if I had made different choices. Should I have told my dad? Should I have confronted Claire earlier? The experience taught me a lot about boundaries, temptation, and the devastating impact of infidelity. While I managed to avoid a full-blown affair, the emotional betrayal was enough to leave lasting scars. And every time I see my dad and Claire together, I can't help but feel a pang of guilt, not just for what happened, but for the secret I continue to keep.